So you can see that I've already started to shade in Mr. Frost's face, right? Before, remember that I had sort of some faint line drawings in there of the features, just making sure I'd mapped them out correctly. I erased my grid lines, and now I'm ready to start shading. Because obviously we don't want grid lines through there, we'll have to just erase all of our hard work. So I've already, as I said, got some stuff going here just so we can kind of have somewhere to start. Notice that you don't see any more of the lines that I actually had originally. I lightened them up if they were a little too dark, and then I shaded up and around all the way over to the line. By shading up to the line, we effectively make it disappear. You can also notice here in the nose, you can especially see that. The nose, I've left a little bit of a line here, so I'll keep shading. But remember that the nose, like the lips or the mouth, really is like, all we ever really get to see is an actual line around the nostrils, and then everything else is value and shading. So you can see here this line. It's actually very faint. You can see on the drawing. It's actually sort of a highlight. So I'm going to go super light on it. But what I'll do is I'll come back, and I know that on the bridge of the nose, there's a little more value. So I'll start to put that value in there. If you notice too, the way I'm holding my pencil, instead of holding it kind of like this, where we've been drawing with it, I actually find that it's a little bit easier to actually turn it over in my hand so that it's like this. I also started to shade his eye a little bit. Remember that we've got some pretty distinct lines in the eye that make up a realistic eye. But again, you want to sort of start shading off of those lines and really start to pay attention to all the subtleties that make up those eyelids. So you've got really subtle values in here. Also, even though his eyelid is there, he's got sort of this sort of fold that kind of drapes over. So I've started to put that in as well. And you want to start light and kind of move to a darker value. Just really pay attention to where your subject has darker values over lighter values. So really, what I want you to know or take away from the demo so far is that you want to erase your grid lines, lighten up any of the lines that you've got, making any corrections you need to, and then do your shading and shade up onto that line. Because once you shade up to that line, the line sort of disappears and it begins to look more realistic. We're going to leave the background totally white. For time, I was just sort of running a little bit late, so I didn't erase all the grid lines back here, but I'd like you to erase all the grid lines throughout the entire rectangle that you drew. Okay, so just a couple of little tricks and tips here. We've got these blenders, remember that? These are really nice because you can make your value shifts even a little bit softer and a little more gradual. Here, especially when you're trying to draw really lightly, you can kind of barely see it there. It's hard to not really leave the texture of the pencil, and so these blenders can sort of smooth that stuff out, and you can get a really nice little light little value there. The blenders are also nice because if you have an area that's just super light, you can gather a bit of graphite from a darker area and bring it over and just transfer a little bit of that graphite onto a really light highlight or something. So use the blender not only as a way to smudge, but you can actually use it as a tool for application. So it's a pretty straightforward tool, so I don't need to do too much, but you can just sort of see how the texture of the drawing is beginning to change a little bit. You might find that you sort of lose a little bit of detail, a little bit of sharpness, and that's to be expected. So you might want to go back in with your pencil, draw back in a little more value. In some of these places, you know, if values are sort of similar, you'll sort of lose definition between a couple of features. So you'll have to sort of use your judgment there and kind of play with it a little bit. Remember too, let's see, I'm going to go ahead and add a bunch, sort of flatten this value out here, and just remind you, a little bit of extra technique, that your eraser is as much a tool as your pencil or even this blender. So I got a little too much value here. We can see here on his nose that there's more of a highlight there at the bridge of his nose, and then also down to on the very top. Also, now we've been using these erasers for a little while, so they're a bit rounded out. A little trick I've got is to, of course, carefully cut that eraser, so now we have a nice sharp edge. You can use that edge of the eraser if you'd like, or if it's a really fine detail, you can just use a little piece that you cut off. And so I'm going to go back in here and remove some value. Just to get that little bit of highlight. I've also got a little too much next to it, so I can go in and just bring it out a little bit. Drawing the value, I think drawing the value in is a little more fun than drawing the lines in, just personally, because you can get really fussy with it. You can just go back and forth and back and forth. I really enjoy that process. Another place that needs a little bit of work is in the teeth. So these teeth really gave me a run for my money. I erased and redrew these things a bunch of times. But I can go back in once I have that nice sharp little eraser and clean things up a little bit. But then also on the lips, you're going to tend to have some highlights as well. So you can kind of sculpt those highlights a little bit too, using your eraser. Again, for some blending, I'll go into the nostril here, solidify that a bit. So using the blender, it kind of gets rid of all that graininess that the pencil picks up on the paper, but then also helps you smoothen transitions. Just as an example, I'm gonna, you can see here that I've still have the outline of his face. Just as an example of what I mean by shading up to a line. We have to have some kind of line to define his face from the background. So we've got to have some value, but we don't want him to look like a cartoon. We're going for a realistic portrait here. So by just bringing a little bit of value all the way up to that line, we sort of make it disappear. And then all of a sudden, what I had was an actual line, but it's actually now an implied line because it's simply a shift in value from the silhouette of my subject to that lighter background. You see how that transformed that piece a little bit? It looks like it's got more dimension. Remember that the outside of a subject is generally going to have a little more value, and it's going to fade as it gets closer to us. That's just sort of a result of, as that figure tilts away from us and foreshortens, we're getting less and less light on it. And then you can bring your blender in, and when you get to this point, smoothen it out. And then you'll likely have to go back in with your eraser and clean it up. So it's just sort of a back and forth process. But just using those few little tips, I think go a long way. Last thing I'll leave you with is, now that we're getting into the really delicate stuff, as you can see, the reason why this blender works is because this graphite is kind of loose on the paper. It'll move around. Last thing you want to do is have your hand resting on all that value that you're working on and smudging it around. So take a blank piece of paper, or even the paper you're working from, and use it just to rest your hand on, even just back here. The paper's not really going to move the graphite unless you're really rubbing it around hard, because your paper doesn't have the oils and the moisture your skin does, so it's not going to pick that graphite up. So last little thing I'll leave you with is draw with your hand resting on on a piece of paper.